Ryan is an animated short created and directed by Chris Landreth, based on the life of fellow Canadian animator Ryan Larkin. Once a brilliant young artist celebrated for his original voice in animation, for his influential films in the late 60s that inspired a generation of animators, Ryan Larkin was now a recovering alcoholic, panhandling on the streets of Montreal to make his ends meet. It is the story of every artist's worst nightmare, the promise of immense possibilities, the loss of creative genius to addiction, and a slow spiral into irrelevance. Landreth, however, in his telling of the story, neither attempts to make us sympathize with nor romanticize the legend of Ryan Larkin.
There are many outcomes to the story of being a great artist, and here's certainly a very interesting outcome.
The film is an interpretation of a conversation between them and includes interviews with other people from Ryan's life. Ryan is an animated documentary with its visual style often described as difficult to describe, and what the filmmaker himself calls psychorealism. To me, the film is Landreth's poignant attempt at simply telling the story of a life he finds compelling, and trying to understand what the story or this telling of it says about his own. And this the film does through an exploration of the boundaries of what was then called computer graphics, to develop a film language that is both wildly imaginative and deeply human. Structuralism is a means to understand the consistent structures beneath any cultural text, how it was created, and the meanings we derive from it. The theory suggests that anything we experience has no inherent meaning that is isolated from culture, and can only be understood in relation to or as different from something else. You know this is a cat not because there is an inherent relationship between the word, the sound,
Cat.
and the image, but because the image doesn't resemble any other entity in your visual memory. It isn't a dog or a swastika or the Eiffel Tower. Semiotics is the study of signs through which we experience these structures. Words, gestures, images, sounds, objects, anything that could be understood by placing it within or against its larger cultural context. In film, a sign could be the camera angle, the shot composition, the lighting, the editing, the sound design, the color of a character's coat, or the half-hidden title of a book on a shelf in the background. Ryan, as bold and quirky as it is, does not really hide its signs. All the people in the film are externalized, disproportionate versions of themselves, their weirdnesses and dysfunctions all laid bare in their physical appearances. Ryan himself is half missing. His limbs are just bones covered in skin, and his head is a thin strip of his face, and some chunks of hair, all eroded perhaps by decades of a difficult life. Felicity, once the love of his life, is depicted through colored lines. Ryan, in contrast, is 3D and desaturated, and as he touches her hand in expression of a mild but familiar regret, parts of his face gain some color. The film begins with Chris talking about his wounds into a mirror, but by the end his head is much less intact, almost like Ryan's, symbolizing that he's a little more willing now to let go of the need to have a socially presentable, fully formed head. Their forms being complete in the mirrors in the end implies that perhaps the missing parts of Ryan weren't lost to years of addiction or pain or artistic failure. Maybe Ryan chose to shed them, to live more freely and authentically. The film is mostly in a realistic 3D style, with the background partially melting to hint at Ryan's state of mild drunkenness. Black and white footage is used when the narrative mentions his youth, and collages of cutouts are animated when the anecdote is humorous. Ryan's successful years are depicted in beautiful 3D, ending with a single spotlight shining on his slender form and his long, lustrous hair. The film is, in fact, rife with symbols throughout its narrative. Some subtle, some direct. Tiny childlike hands reaching out of their heads to communicate what these two men will keep to themselves out of an adult politeness. Hands out of the bottle of alcohol that adores Ryan and is rude to Chris for intervening. The halo of light over Chris as he prides himself in his advice. The shots of red spikes out of Ryan's head. The little tribute to Magritte's Son of Man, a hint at Ryan being connected to the artist he once was, and a cursory reminder that what we see here hides something else about him. Karl Marx feared that capitalism could generate in people an alienation from the work they do, as it becomes an object that exists outside of them, a role imposed and played only to make money that could then be used to satisfy human needs. In film studies, the theory helps analyze the depiction of anti-capitalist ideas or themes of mindless consumerism, using filmmaking techniques developed in the 1920s. Soviet filmmakers in the early 20th century saw film as a means to highlight class conflict and promote powerful rhetoric in their work, through editing, focus, imagery, and other narrative techniques. But the theory is relevant in understanding how films, even today, represent or fail to represent the cultural distribution of power, to understand how conscious a filmmaker is of how these ideas manifest in their society.
This is the Principality of Monaco. Money comes here and it just kind of stays, it swims in this kind of holding tank. And people kind of, wash their armpits with it.
Ryan, in his outburst, is seen to be struggling still with how his art was valued, monetized, and ripped off. He cannot understand, decades after having chosen to leave a promising career for a life on the streets, how money functions at different levels in society. How some people spend $10, which would mean so much to him, every 15 minutes. At the prime of his career, Ryan became disillusioned with the bureaucracy of the industry that required him to be productive. And this sense of being alienated from his work, coupled with his cocaine addiction, ensured that he would find it impossible to persist with animation, a medium that requires hours of quiet, patient work, day after day.
Creativity, what do you think I can do, I cannot do anything. I've been deprived. Deprivation is the most devastating thing.
We could look at Ryan through lenses of several other film theories and understand a little more of what it achieves as an animated documentary, and also where it could have done a little more to tell a fuller story. Despite being a deeply inquisitive portrayal of an artist, a man who's been in romantic and sexual relationships with both men and women, the film barely mentions this aspect of Ryan's life. His only partner in the story is a woman, and his only comment on that relationship is a bittersweet regret over not having had kids. It suggests that our identities are the ego's interaction with the environment, as it suppresses our hidden desires while also struggling with a higher morality. Events from Ryan's childhood that must have shaped his art, his work, and his relationships are mentioned in passing in the film. A violent father, an adored brother he watched die in a boating accident, all while he was still a sensitive, artistic child. Landreth's depiction of Ryan comes from a deep curiosity and respect for Ryan's inner world. The filmmaker's desire to understand how Ryan's creativity or anxieties are expressed in the way he lived his life is also a desire to understand himself, his own dread of personal failure. While the film says many things about artistic flair, integrity, fear, addiction, and social acceptance, each of which could be explored through closer analysis, the film also says by the end that it knows little about Ryan Larkin. In Ryan, as in a walk down an unfamiliar street, what you see is what you choose to see, and says more about who you are than about who he is. Film theory does provide a potent lens, not merely to deconstruct and analyze a film, but to see a little deeper, to experience a film more meaningfully. So with Ryan, maybe the point isn't to get inside his fragile head and decode the functioning of his mind, but to stop and find a moment of human connection with someone you would otherwise walk past without a second thought.
Spare change, sir. Spare change. Thank you, sir. Spare change. You have a spare change, sir. Spare change, sir. Thank you, sir. Oh, you're very kind.